Hi guys, welcome or welcome back to my channel. Welcome to another monthly reading wrap up. February was a crazy busy month for me. It's also the shortest month of the year, so I didn't read quite as many books as I normally would. And also something to note is I have a reading vlog on my channel for every single book that I read in February aside from one book. So if you've already watched the reading vlogs, this wrap up might be a tad bit repetitive. But if there's any books that I talk about today that you want to hear more in-depth thoughts on, definitely check out the reading vlogs. But I know there's some people that would rather hear about books in a wrap-up as opposed to a reading vlog. I'm the same way sometimes, so let's go ahead and get into it. I read 6 books total in February, but we're going to talk about 7 because the first books I want to talk about are all part of a trilogy, and I wanted to wait until I had read all the books in the trilogy to just share my complete thoughts on the books as a whole as well as individually. So that trilogy is the Dreamland Billionaire series by Lauren Asher. I also filmed a reading vlog on this trilogy, so I did want to wait until that was up to share more thoughts. But this trilogy is super popular, widely beloved. You've probably heard of it if you've not already read it yourself, but it's following these 3 grandsons, and their grandfather has just passed away. Their grandfather created this really famous theme park called Dreamland, which is basically like Disney World, and he is essentially like Walt Disney is how I thought of him while I was reading this book. But they're obviously a very wealthy family, and so the grandfather, Brady Kane, when he passes, he leaves a huge chunk of his inheritance to the 3 grandsons. But there is a contingency with that. They have to each complete a different task that he has set out for each of the grandsons in order to attain their part of the inheritance. So each book follows a different grandson, and the plot follows them trying to complete their task, and each brother has their own romance as well. The first book in the trilogy is The Fine Print. I read this book in January, but like I said, I haven't shared any of my thoughts yet because I wanted to wait until I read all the books. But The Fine Print follows the first grandson, Rowan, and his task that he has to complete in order to get his part of the inheritance is basically to make Dreamland better in some way. His grandfather wanted him to kind of bring out his creative side again that he felt like had been lost throughout his life, and so he basically is working with the Dreamland employees to come up with innovative ways to make the park better. He ends up meeting Zara, who is a very sunshiny, bubbly girl who works for Dreamland, and she ends up being on the team that is helping Rowan to come up with ways to make the park better, and it follows their romance throughout. So I have a very unpopular opinion about this book. I did not like it at all. I gave it 1.5 stars. This book to me just felt way too tropey. I feel like there was almost like a checklist when this book was written, and it was like, okay, we need to include this, include this, include this, and like certain plot points were in there just to fulfill a certain trope. And they were tropes that I already am not like really a big fan of. We've got grumpy sunshine. I just don't tend to like a grumpy man. Workplace romance, I'm not a big fan of. There were so many other tropes, like honestly too many to remember because it just felt like they were kind of thrown in there, like I said, for the sake of having more tropes. But this book was just like super long. The pacing was very odd to me. This book felt like so much was told to us, but not a lot was shown. We would kind of get from point A to point B, and when we got to point B, we were told like, oh, this, and this has happened, but you never really saw like the in-between or the progression to how that happened. So it left me kind of confused, and I felt like it would jump really fast into a new scene before I had even like acclimated to the previous scene. So I just didn't really ever have a good grasp of the story. Nothing was pulling me in. But I would say my biggest issue with this book was that I didn't really like Zara's character at all. She felt super childish. She felt very immature. And the connection between her and Rowan felt super forced. They kissed really, really early on out of absolutely nowhere. So like the tension was broken so quickly. And after that, I felt like it was trying to build up their romance, and I just didn't care at all. So I really did hate this book. I hate to say it, but it just didn't work for me at all. The reason it's a 1.5 star and not just a 1 star is because it did have a really great representation. So that's what the half star is for. But other than that, was not a fan of this book at all, sadly. So after reading the fine print, I was a little hesitant to jump into book 2, but I had heard a lot of people say that book 2 is so much better than book 1. So I decided to give it a chance, and the second book is Terms and Conditions. This is following another grumpy grandson, Declan, and Declan's task that he has to complete to get his part of the inheritance is that he has to get married and then he has to have a baby with someone. So his secretary Iris is trying to set him up with all these women, and it just falls through because he's just a very grumpy man and none of these women can put up with him. So Iris is a very loyal, faithful employee. She decides that she will marry Declan to help him out. So it becomes a marriage of convenience, kind of like fake dating, but I guess fake marriage trope. And I liked this book so much better. I loved Iris as a character. I feel like Iris, out of all 3 books, was my favorite female main character. I just loved her. I felt like she had a lot of depth to her. She and Declan's dynamic made a whole lot of sense because Declan is very career oriented. Work has kind of been his whole life. So Iris has been at the center of that for the time she's worked for Declan. She kind of understands what makes him tick. She understands how he can be. She can deal with his moods and his attitude in a way that no one else can, and she can dish it right back out at him. And Declan really respects Iris for that. And their dynamic just really, like I said, worked for me, and it made sense. I understood like why Iris would agree to marry Declan to help him out and to be a good employee. And it just made sense to me, and I really liked their romance. There was nothing I disliked about this book, but I just wasn't obsessed with it. My feelings toward it were just very, very neutral the whole time I was reading it. Looking back on it, I feel like I like it a lot better, especially after coming off of reading the fine print. But overall, I just feel so average about it. So I think I've landed on like a 2.5 star rating. There were times I was reading when it felt like a 2 star. There were times I was reading it when it felt like a 3 star. So somewhere in the middle feels right for this book, and I'm gonna go with 2.5 stars. And then the third and final book in the trilogy that came out pretty recently, it came out I think the last day in January, that is The Final Offer. And this book follows the last brother, Cal, and he is supposed to be like the sunshiny golden retriever brother out of the 3. His task that his grandfather gives him to get his part of the inheritance is to live in this lake house for the summer that he went to growing up, and he also has to sell it by the end of the summer. But the only catch with that is that Cal's first love, Alana, is currently living in the house, and her name is also on the deed, and she does not want to sell the house at all. So it's kind of like a second chance romance, him trying to convince Lana to sell the house. And this book was definitely my absolute favorite of the 3. Comparing it to the fine print, it's like night and day. Lauren Asher's writing got so much better. I thought this book was so well crafted, and I was really, really excited for Lana and Cal to get together. I was rooting for them. Cal is definitely my favorite of the 3 brothers. When I first started reading this book, I feel like it kind of took me by surprise because, like I said, Cal's supposed to be the more sunshiny golden retriever type brother, but he started out being a little bit grumpy, and this book was a lot heavier and darker than I thought it would be because it focused on Cal's struggle with alcohol addiction, which I was not anticipating that at all. So it took me a little bit to get into the story, but once I was at like the 30% mark, I was really enjoying my time reading it, and I was surprised how much I was enjoying it with how I felt about books 1 and even book 2. It was just so much better. Also, it took me by surprise because this book has things in it that I normally don't really like. I'm not usually a fan of small town romances because they feel so generic and all the books feel kind of samey to me. Also, not a fan at all of children in books, and this book has a child in it, but I loved the child in this book. She provided the perfect amount of comedic relief, and I thought she was so adorable, and she just like made the story so much better. However, that being said, this book felt like a 4 star pretty much the whole way through until the end. And then Lana's character kind of got on my nerves because Cal was like working through his alcohol addiction, and Lana was like upset about some things that Cal had done, and understandably so, but Cal was groveling in a way that was just like so easy to forgive him. and I felt like Lana was being kind of like unsympathetic towards his addiction, and I just didn't really like how she was acting towards Cal. And it was kind of at the point where I'm like, girl, if you don't want him, like, I'll take him. I don't know, I just didn't like how she was at the end, so that kind of bumped it down a little bit for me, and I landed on a 3.5 star. But Final Offer definitely was my favorite book of the three by far. Cal was my favorite of the three brothers. Iris was definitely my favorite of the three female characters. But overall, I don't like this series as much as everyone else. It's not something I would really recommend, but I'm glad I read it to see what other people like. Sometimes you just have to see for yourself, but don't regret reading it. Okay, and then the next three books that I read during the week of Valentine's Day. All of these books take place on or around Valentine's Day, and I read them for a romance reading vlog. So the first book I read for that vlog is Darling Venom by Parker S. Huntington. This book follows Charlotte and Kellen. They meet one day on Valentine's Day on the roof of their school, and they both are wanting to jump from the roof because they're both suicidal. This book is very heavy and intense, so make sure you check trigger warnings if you're interested in picking it up. But Charlotte and Kellen come to a pact that day on the roof that they're going to meet once a year on top of the roof on Valentine's Day to kind of check on one another and keep each other going even though they're struggling. And they really lean on one another and like vent to each other about the struggles in their own personal lives. And on the fourth Valentine's Day, Kellen does break his part of the pact. So once that happens, we flash forward in time a few years. Charlotte's a little bit older, and she ends up meeting Kellen's older brother Tate. And all Charlotte knows about Tate is what she's heard about him through Kellen, which is only horrible things because Kellen hated his brother Tate. But Charlotte and Tate are attracted to each other, so it makes their relationship very complicated. They end up leaning on one another and working through their shared grief of Kellen. And it focuses on their romance, but also it's a story mostly, I would say, about grief. This book is marketed mainly as a romance, but I do think it covers more heavy and intense topics first, and the romance is more the subplot. But I really, really enjoyed this book. I absolutely loved the writing. It was so quotable, like literally every page had the most beautiful metaphor on it. I have so many highlights from this book. There were a few scenes that were kind of like weird and iffy to me and not really realistic, but overall I did think it was a very beautiful story, so I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. The next book I read for that vlog was The No-Show by Beth O'Leary. All you should know going into this book is that we follow 3 women who get stood up by the same man on Valentine's Day. This book was so good. It was very slow to start. It was a little bit hard to get into, but once like the 40-ish% mark hit, I was so hooked and becoming so obsessed with this book. We get perspectives from all 3 of the women, and I loved each of them so much. They were all very distinct from one another, but the whole time you're like, why is this man leading on these 3 women? Like, what is going on? And there is the craziest plot twist at the end that I did not see coming at all. It was so well done. It makes you question like how you didn't see it coming the whole time. I ended up giving this one 4.75 stars. It's almost a 5-star, but not quite, just because it was a slow start. But this is a new favorite for me for sure. This was by far my favorite book I read in February, so I highly recommend reading it. I loved it so much. Don't be surprised if you see this in my favorites at the end of the year video, because it was so good. The last book I read for that reading vlog is The Do-Over by Lynn Painter. This is a YA romance. I feel like so many people read this last month for Valentine's Day. It follows a Groundhog Day type of plot where our main character, Emily, is reliving Valentine's Day over and over. And on this Valentine's Day, she catches her boyfriend cheating on her. So each day when she wakes up, she's trying to fix all the issues that go wrong on this Valentine's Day to make it the perfect Valentine's Day. And I thought it was super cute. There was one day that she relived in particular that I really liked, where she basically lives the day with no regrets, and they go around the city and do all these things, and I thought it was so fun to read about. I loved that part of it. But other than that, it was like super YA. I'm definitely not the target audience. It felt very, very high school, so I had trouble relating to the characters, and the plot didn't really pull me in. I think in my reading vlog I said I gave it 3.5 stars, but maybe like a 3.25, somewhere around there. It was cute, but just not something I connected with that deeply. And the last book that I read in February, this is the only book that I didn't vlog, so I have not talked about it yet on my channel. That is none other than Icebreaker by Hannah Grace. This book has been absolutely everywhere, so hyped up, so I'm sure you've at least seen it, heard about it, if you've not already read it yourself. So this one follows Nate Hawkins, the captain of the hockey team, and Anastasia Allen, who is a figure skater. They both go to the same university in California, and one day something happens to the hockey team's rink. Someone like turns off the generator, so the ice melts and their rink is not usable anymore. So the figure skating team and the hockey team end up having to share one rink. And the figure skaters are not too happy about this, especially Anastasia Allen. She is a very grumpy girl, but she's also training really hard to make it to the Olympics. So she needs all the rink time she can get. She is not keen on sharing a rink with the hockey team. But Nate, on the other hand, is our golden retriever, peacekeeping man. He's like, let's just make the best out of this. We're going to be seeing each other a lot, so there's nothing we can do about it. And of course, seeing each other a lot is what happens, and a romance does ensue between Nate and Stassi. And like I said, this book has been so hyped up everywhere, so I went into it with super high expectations, and I feel like that ruined it a little bit for me. Last month I read The Deal for the first time and absolutely fell in love with it. I went into that book thinking I wasn't gonna really like it, and it ended up blowing me away. It's now a new favorite that I gave 5 stars to. So I've heard so many people say that Icebreaker is a million times better than the Off-Campus series. I even heard someone say that reading Icebreaker made them realize that The Deal isn't that good of a book. So I was like, wow, if I gave The Deal 5 stars, this is gonna be like a 6-star book. I'm gonna be obsessed with it. And I'm making it sound like I hate this book. I didn't at all. I gave it 4 stars. I think I was just a little bit let down because of how hyped up this book was. I feel like Stassi and Nate's dynamic wasn't what I expected at all. I thought it was going to be more romantic from the get-go than it was, and it really kind of started out as a friends with benefits type of relationship. They also got together way sooner than I was expecting and than I would typically have liked. I kind of wanted the tension to build up a little bit more. But the longer the book went on and the more you see like the ins and outs and the ups and downs of their relationship, I was really loving it. I really liked the friend group in this. I really liked the found family aspects. My biggest issue, I would say, is with the plot. I feel like this book is so long and it really could have been condensed because there were some moments where it was just pure fluff. And I feel like the spice sometimes took the front seat and the plot took a back seat. And I just thought there was going to be more storyline to this book. Also, I was fooled by the cover. This book was a lot more spicy than I was expecting. Like, the Uber scene is going to live in my mind rent-free until the end of time. Like, I was not expecting it from these two, but the spice was good. I just feel like there should have been a little more to the plot. If this had been condensed just a bit, it would have been a 5-star most likely, or a 4.5 from me. Also, everyone talks about how amazing Nate Hawkins is, and he was great, but I honestly still like Garrett Graham better. So I don't know, the communication in this book was really great, and that was something I did enjoy about it. But I think I just had too high of expectations. But overall, I did really like it. I think it was cute. It's a solid 4-star book for me. I am now so obsessed with hockey romances, so leave all your recommendations below, and I can't wait to continue out with this series. And with that, those are all the books I read in February, so that will conclude this monthly reading wrap-up. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. If you did, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button down below if you're not already subscribed to my channel. Like I said, if you want any more in-depth thoughts on any of the books that I have reading vlogs for, make sure you check below in the description box. I will have them all linked for you guys to watch. Thank you guys so much for following me on my reading journey. I will see you so soon in another video. Bye guys.